What the market always makes us do is try to produce more with less. If I don't have the ability to sort based on profit and loss, because I don't have a market and I don't have prices, I'm not going to be able to dictate whether or not I should be in A or B. If only we would have, if only Trotsky would have, hung around or whatever and not defeated by Stalin. That argument doesn't hold water because Trotsky himself was, in fact, quite a totalitarian. You might have invention, but you don't have innovation. And it's innovation that generates the prosperity that we all benefit from.
Hello and welcome to IEA Interviews. Today I'm joined by Professor Peter Boettke, who is a professor of economics at George Mason University. He has, of course, written for us before. He's no stranger to the Institute. Today we're going to talk about artificial intelligence and what it means for capitalism, but also what it means for socialism. And if you don't mind, Peter, let's start with the second point, because this is one of my personal obsessions. I know you've written a lot about this too. Before we go into the issue of techno-socialism, could you just tell, say, an uninitiated or semi-initiated listener what the original socialist calculation debate was about in the 1920s and 1930s? And we will get to why this matters now and in the 2020s, but just to go back historically one step, what was the socialist calculation debate?
Thank you, and thank you for this conversation. The core idea of the socialist calculation debate was whether or not you could substitute for private ownership in the means of production, collective ownership of means of production, and at the same time generate a rationalization of the production process such that you could generate a burst of productivity that would move us from, as the Marxists would say, the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. The whole term rational comes from Marx and his followers because what they wanted to do was rationalize production.
Mm-hmm. They talk about anarchy in production under capitalism.
Yeah, production under capitalism was anarchistic. And it was behind the backs of the citizens. We needed to bring it out in front and rationalize it. And the way they were going to do that was through collective ownership of the means of production, as well as, some notion of comprehensive planning. Now, it's up for grabs whether or not their notion of comprehensive planning meant that under the new socialist regime, because when you change the material base, you change the superstructure, that you dialectic method. Right? He's a dialectic materialist, but dialectics is what matters here, which meant that the way knowledge advanced in his mind was through critique. And so, while Marx said he didn't write any, recipe books for the future, he did argue that socialism would be the opposite of what capitalism was. That's the method, right? So in his critique of capitalism, you see the positive image of socialism. And he does say that the imagery is of an orchestra in which no one owns the instruments, but still someone is the conductor. All right. But let's go back to the real thrust of the matter, which is, can collective ownership of the means of production achieve rationalization of the production process? And this is where Ludwig von Mises steps in, because what he argues is he doesn't argue against trying to rationalize production. As a positive economist before statistics, you followed the Weber approach, which is you treated ends as given and limited your analysis to the effectiveness of the chosen means to achieve those given ends. And Mises is trying to show that without collective ownership and without private property in the means of production, meaning collective ownership, without private property, you can't have a market for those means of production. Without a market for those means of production, you can't have relative prices. And without relative prices as inputs into economic decision-making, economic investors cannot decide to pursue Project A or Project B. They're not able to make that calculation. Why that matters is because what the calculation enables me to do is sort from the technologically feasible projects to those which are economically viable. and put it in basic economic language, what the market always makes us do is try to produce more with less. If I don't have the ability to sort based on profit and loss, because I don't have a market and I don't have prices, I'm not going to be able to dictate whether or not I should be in A or B, and I end up producing less with more. And this is the fate of the socialist economies. If I produce less with more, I can't rationalize production. And so Mises's argument wasn't that you couldn't. When he says socialism is impossible, he doesn't mean that you can't try to be socialist, right? You can try, but what socialists can't do is they can't achieve their stated ends, which is this burst of productivity. They can't rationalize production. And there's a whole host of other implications that follow from that. Because they can't engage in that kind of planning, this is what Hayek later adds to it. They make decisions not on economic grounds, but on political grounds. And that ends up by being the reason why you have these great concentrations of power and the abuse of that power, especially when the logic leads to why the worst get on top. And so socialism was condemned rather than delivering us to the kingdom of freedom, but instead delivering us to hell on earth by making us have economic deprivation and political tyranny. And that's common in all the different experiments. So you can't just say, oh, it was bad leaders. If only we would have, if only Trotsky would have, hung around or whatever and not defeated by Stalin. That argument doesn't hold water because Trotsky himself was in fact quite a totalitarian, right? As we know in the the way he treated the Kronstadt Rebellion and all these other things, that he did.
And he was in favor of Stalin's collectivizations as well. Yes. He even said he would have done it earlier.
Yeah. He in fact, this is the story that everyone misses when the Trotskyites try to tell their story, is that he wanted collectivization to go further earlier during the net period, right? And he was the left-wing childishness that Stalin dismissed in the purges, whereas Nikolai Bukharin, who was the architect of both war communism, but then also the new economic policy, he was the right-wing deviationist. And just related to our story, and then we can go to the next thing, is Bukharin, prior to the revolution, was sent by Lenin to go study in Vienna. And he wrote a book because Bombavrik, Mises' teacher, had written a book called Karl Marx and the Close of His System. And so Marxists, the intellectual Marxists, wanted to rebut Bombavrik's criticisms. So he was sent to study in Vienna, and his time that he was in Vienna would have overlapped when Mises and Otto Bauer and all these other people were in Bombavrik's seminar as well. And so they knew each other. And when Bukharin was the architect of new economic policy in the 1925 paper, which later was the one that got him, on the bad side of Stalin. He actually
not the side we want to be on in those days.
No. But he actually invokes Mises in the piece. He famously said in this piece that the peasants should enrich themselves. We need to give the land back to the peasants. We need to allow markets. We hold on to the commanding heights. That is the, industry, but we need to somehow, get markets because we're not quite ready for socialism. His argument is that it was a culture issue. If we have enough cultural education, then, the peasants and everyone else and the workers will be able to experience socialism in the future. But he literally invokes Mises and describes him as the most learned critic of communism. And that's a 1925 paper. So Mises' criticism was appreciated by the Marxists of the time, Otto Bauer, and then also Nikolai Bukharin. Otto Bauer was an Austro-Marxist, and Bukharin, of course, is Bolshevik. And but they understood and appreciated the point because it was a means-ends argument. Their means cannot logically obtain their ends that they sought. And so they have to try to fix that puzzle. And, after that, various different ways. And, that's what we'll talk about, because everyone thinks it's about technology. If I just had enough technology, then they can do it. And so everyone was searching for the appropriate technologies after that to try to fix the failure that was in their face. Yeah.
Yeah, so even the socialist side of that calculation debate, they took von Mises and Hayek very seriously, which is unusual for them. They would normally just say, well, these guys are agents of the capitalist class, and therefore we will just ignore what they say. It's all propaganda. And Oskar Lange, one of the other opponents of von Mises, said, no, in the future socialist planning ministry, we will have a statue of von Mises because he forced us to think about these issues more seriously. But yes, the idea was at the time that you just have too many different production combination possibilities. You can have, so even the things that we're recording this on, they're using, even though the physical materials going into this are fairly simple, you have a bit of plastic, metal, glass, but nonetheless, there's millions of different ways in which you could produce this. And if you don't have market prices for the factors of production, there's no way to work out which of the trillions of feasible ways of producing things are efficient. Now, okay, there are today, and this is where we move to the 2020s.
Yeah,
we can find people on the socialist side who would accept your argument up until this point. I would say yes, maybe the Hayek-Mises side of the socialist calculation debate, maybe they were right then. Maybe it was not possible for the Soviet Union in the 1930s to conduct rational planning without market prices, but we can do it today because we have AI. We just feed all the information about physical availability, the quantities of all the different means of and factors of production. We just put that into an AI program and tell it more or less what we want from it. And then we can have, rather than, a central planning committee that comes up with a plan that is maybe out of date by the time they finish their calculations, or things change all the time and it's too static and not sufficiently flexible. But why don't we have why don't we use the computer power that we have now and replace central planning committees with an intelligent socialist people's AI program?
Okay, so it's a great question. And I'll try to be sharp in answering it. I don't know if I will be, but the first thing I want to point out is that the modifiers of technology and of democracy have always been with us in the socialist debate. So a lot of people today say, oh, we don't want Soviet style, planning. We want democratic socialism. But the reality is if you went back to the 19-teens and 1920s, the Bolsheviks wanted democratic socialism too, true democratic socialism. And that's why, the term Bolshevik means majority in Russian. Soviet is worker councils, right? These are the translation of the terms. Also, whatever the latest technology was at the time was always being heralded as the solution. So, in a weird way, that's going to sound strange, I think, to listeners today. But, the Soviets thought they were using the most advanced technology of the time, German war planning that comes from World War I. How did the Germans, engage in war planning? We're going to do that in peacetime. Then in the 20s, it became scientific management. The capitalist Fred Taylor had come up with this idea of piece rate monitoring of the firms and scientific management. We're going to do scientific management. Then it's linear programming, right? We're going to get linear programming, operations research, right? And then we're going to have cybernetics, or Leontief's input-output table. Everyone was drawing always on what the latest technology is. So that's as this background. Today, we also have this issue of technology and technological advances, and can't we make use of it? So my first point is the modifiers don't change the fundamental problem. The problem was never one of computational complexity. It was an issue of the utilization, the discovery, utilization, and communication of unique knowledge that economic actors engage in. Here's the issue. It is not just a complicated task like emptying a beach of sand with a spoon. And now we can use a backhoe, and then we could use something else, right? It's not that, because the point that Mises and Hayek were trying to make is that the sand and the spoon literally don't exist except for the exchange behavior that comes into account. I have no idea what the mutually beneficial exchange opportunity is or the least cost technology is unless I, in fact, am engaging in that competitive process of exchange and production. So the modifiers don't solve the problem. Now, let's talk a little bit about the issues that's involved in techno-socialism, because one of the real issues, first of all, I'm in a debate on this issue in the journal called the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. I have a paper in there with my colleague Rosalino Candela called On the Feasibility of Techno-Socialism. And some techno-socialists respond that, okay, we're going to build this objective function in our, production process. We're going to use all the advanced, technologies, and we'll be able to solve the problem that you guys confront. But when you read their article, when they get to the issue of innovation and whatnot, what they say is, we're just going to use the planner's preference to solve the problem, right? And then they just go on, right? And so it gives away the whole shop, actually, in the story. So I think that, there's some misinformation about technology and the promise of it. So I think there's misinformation about the cybernetics and Glushkov's reforms in the 1960s in the Soviet Union. And I think there's misinformation about cybersyn in Chile and its effectiveness under Allende, because a lot of the romantic notions that we can substitute for the market with advanced computer technologies is built on the idea that these earlier efforts showed great promise, right? That these earlier efforts showed us that we can solve, Hayek's, problem and also the, Mises and Hayek's problem, whatever. And I think the actual facts are not at all accurate with that. Like, so for example, the Allende regime, which most people, this is no defense of Pinochet. So make sure everyone understands that. But Allende was a disaster on economics, 300% inflation. The cybersyn thing did not eliminate the kind of techno ambitions of the different, groups that concentrated power in themselves. And so it didn't even solve the political problem, to get the democracy stuff. Same thing in cybernetics in the Soviet Union. I mean, they originally started out by trying to figure out a way to update the linear programming models, but it's not like Soviet growth rates, true growth rates in the 1960s. I mean, the phony ones that they gave, seem to say it's going up. But when we recalculate what we've done as in the post-communist period, as we recalculate those growth rates, they didn't experience that kind of, success in their planning process. The economy was plagued by shortages, production inefficiencies, the same thing. The 1-ton nail kind of idea is still, in operation here. So why is it that even with techno-socialism, we can't actually rationalize production? And I think that one of the ways to think about this is the difference between an algorithmic society and a free society. And I'll stop after making this point real quick. But, in social epistemology literature, we make a distinction between what we call kind learning environments and wicked learning environments. And so in a kind learning environment, you have fixed set of parameters. So think of the game of chess. There's a lot of moves in the game of chess, but you're bounded. There's only so many spaces on the board. Each of the pieces on the chessboard have very specific rules about what they can do in that. And so when Deep Blue plays Kasparov in chess, what they're doing is just churning through all the algorithms that, by the way, Kasparov has also memorized, because that's what it means to be a great grandmaster in chess. If you asked them about the history of chess, so-and-so in 1955 did this move to win, and they know all of that. So they know all the moves. It's just the computer can access them much faster. That's a kind learning environment. It's learning within a fixed set of parameters. In the market economy, it's much more like the parameters are relatively free. That's why we get innovations that are totally different than what we imagined before. It's not like just, you get a car with wings on it, kind of thing, right? You get innovations that are radically different from what the departure was before because of creativity, novelty, innovation. And so that's called a wicket learning environment, in which you're learning within an environment in which the parameters are relatively free rather than fixed. And I think the vibrancy of a market economy is much more like a wicket learning environment than a kind learning environment. I haven't even brushed on the subject of the consciousness or any of the deep philosophical issues associated with mind and machine, but just those different learning environments. And it's not a question of the computer catching up to the relatively free parameters. It's that the computer doesn't operate in a world of relatively free parameters. It operates in the world of the algorithms, and even like large language models, right? If we dig deep into what they're doing, they're just following Bayes' law, right? And they're updating Bayes' law. So it's probabilities. That's within a fixed set of parameters, set rules about how you update. That's different from the world that we live in when we have creative expectations, right? Which is not Bayes' law necessarily. Or we have biases, which is that, our priors are so strong we don't give them up, which is also a very human thing to do. Not a good thing that humans always do it, but sometimes it is. But that's the world of the humans. This is the world of the machines. The machines can't do what the humans, do. Yeah.
So they're trying to solve the wrong kind of problem. They think it's just about processing the data more quickly, whereas in reality what happens is in a market economy, well, we don't know. The market economy doesn't have a fixed goal that it's driving to. That's what we're going to do in a market environment is something that we don't know until we actually are in that environment and are acting as market participants and trying to do things, satisfy our preferences and so forth. Now, if some of our readers want to hear from the other side as well, who are the techno-socialists? Can you give us some names there or publications? Who are the main people within that movement?
So the number one person who's really been doggedly pursuing this is a guy named Alain Cottrell, and his author, this guy, I can't remember his first name now, but it's Cockshott and Cottrell, and then followers of them. So they've been trying to answer this question for a long time. They have a big, thick manuscript that's free online that they've made available for everyone to sort of, try to dig up and look at. But then there's, of course, other people that you would say are like techno enthusiasts about these ideas. And there's some younger scholars that are working that. But among the older ones, Duncan Foley, who is a very successful old Marxist thinker. He teaches at the New School for Social Research. He published a paper about 2 years ago, which goes over the whole history of the discussion of socialism from his point of view. And he ends talking about the Santa Fe people and the modern computer technologies being able to resolve some of the situations and stuff. So I would start with Duncan Foley, and his thinking about it. And then I would go to like this Cockshott and Cottrell stuff. And then other people after that, there's, but a lot of times, it's so the reason why I'm bumbling a little bit on the question is because a lot of the literature is not technically sophisticated as much as it is, romantically polemical. If I can, it's tied up with, modern criticisms of capitalism, the sort of rise of the kind of populist socialism, Bernie Sanders types or whatever. And they point to things like Walmart and large international corporations. And they say they rely on computer, programming. Why can't the entire economy, rely on that? And it goes to your point, I think, what you stated very nicely, which is markets as a whole don't have a goal, right? Whereas Walmart has a goal. Amazon has a goal, right? They have a residual claimant at the end of the day. There's no residual claimant for the economy. And
so what they can also do, Walmart, of course, is that they can access data from their consumers who are buying things from Walmart. Okay, but they are already acting in a market environment.
Right.
They are already market participants.
Yeah. And so, so that would be there's a book by this guy King, which is also, in fact, I think the term techno-socialism might have been coined in that book. But there's also other people who refer to, that's more like the cybersyn and Soviet cybernetics. It's sometimes called techno-communism. And that sort of made a rise. Look, your book is as relevant today as it was ever, and you should reissue it with a chapter having to do with these new criticisms, because you have such a comprehensive examination of why socialism continues to rear its head, like over time. And so it's come back again in vengeance in a way that is even different than like what you had captured at the end of your book when you wrote it, I guess maybe a decade ago now, is it? Or I don't know.
5 years, 6 years.
6 years, yeah.
Yeah,
so
time for second edition, I guess.
Yeah, 2019 was when it was published, right? Yeah. So, and it's a great book. I recommend it to everyone. I all your listeners should get it today. But these ideas, hope springs eternal, as you might say, right? Hope springs eternal.
But it needs an excuse. So would it be fair to say, if we look at the millennial socialist movement of today, so somebody like Zoran Mamdani, who is most likely to be mayor of New York in a couple of weeks, okay, he would probably not call himself a techno-socialist, and he would probably not even be familiar with these authors that you mentioned. But do you think it's fair to say that the mere fact that these currents, these schools of thought exist, and that somebody like Zoran Mamdani may have heard of them, do you think this gives the socialists of today, this new wave of socialists, an excuse? Is it maybe fair to say that they would say, well, okay, I'm not the theorist behind this. I wouldn't personally know how to run our super intelligent AI socialism, our new techno-socialist utopia, but they are there, they exist, and therefore I have permission to propagate these ideas. And once I'm the president, or once I get my socialist utopia, then these more sophisticated scholars, they would be in charge of the planning process, and they would come up with their version of democratic socialism.
Yeah, so I think what's going on is that someone like Mamdani is making a normative appeal of socialism and why it is. So there's two levels of it. One of it is like a kid who's running for, 8th grade president of his school and promises to give free lunches to everyone. And so everyone's like, yeah, okay, that sounds good. He's promising to, healthcare, housing, free bus rides, this kind of stuff like that. So it's just your typical kind of promissory politics, impassioned by a certain sort of romantic rhetoric about how the world would be better off if we just cared about one another better. So that's what he calls socialism, right? So, but the question, this is sort of similar to Hillary Clinton or the Clintons when they went to first be governor of Arkansas. And they their first administration in Arkansas was a disaster because they tried to implement their policies, and then Bill Clinton reinvented himself as a fiscal conservative Democrat and then rose to fame, right? But when they were in power, they also tried some of these ideas. For example, Hillary care, or their healthcare policies. And the designer of that was a guy named Ira Magaziner. And Ira Magaziner was like a true card-carrying believer in planning and social control. But he never got elected. He was just the Clintons' advisor. And I think that that's going to happen with Mamdani. He's going to have advisors who think that technically we now have the tools at our disposal so that they can achieve their goals without having the unintended, undesirable consequences, right? So right now, one of the big fears, of course, is that, he's going to raise the income tax that he claims to 52%, or he's going to tax other kinds of profit-making business activity. And, there'll be capital flight out of New York City, right? People will migrate and everything like that. And so they're going to try to figure out a way that they can get the revenues without that loss. And they're going to think these modern techniques give them that ability to do it. That's where I would say it would come in. I don't think he's, ideologically a techno-socialist. At least that's not the rhetoric that he's been playing on. He's been playing much more on the sort of moral appeal of being against crony capitalism, right? Some of the arguments, we would be sympathetic to, right? So, ever since the military industrial complex since 9/11, which has grown up, the fact that the big investment banks got bailed out with our money after the global financial crisis, the fact that the political system seems to be corrupt and it slows down the ability of the younger generation to be able to build a stake in the future. So it's zero-sum thinking that's all going on. And so he's hitting a chord, especially with young people. And the other thing he's hitting a chord with is it's a very controversial thing in the intellectual elites in the United States at the moment, the policies towards Israel and Gaza. And so, in the older generation of left-leaning intellectuals, we're very pro-Israel. The younger generation is not. And so in the last presidential election, this caused a huge schism because the Democratic candidate couldn't run on a anti-Israel program because the elite of the party were all old people, were pro-Israel. At the same time, the younger generation, which would have been motivated to go out, get the vote and things like that. So think about that with Obama. They didn't come out for Harris. So they just didn't show up because they were disaffected by the whole thing. And even Harris in her campaign constantly faced heckling over the administrative stance on Israel versus Palestine. And so he is playing into that. So it's quite obvious that, he's for at best, or at worst, a two-party solution, kind of thing. And he's very much part of the whole world of the post-colonial studies, oppression or oppressor, and he feeds into that rhetoric. And so the young people are energized. The people who are frustrated with the corruption of the current regime, of the corruption of the previous governor and who is his opponents, right? So Adams, Cuomo, these are his opponents. There's no one there that stands in his way. And so there you have it. But his advisors, because of the intellectual brain trust he will draw on, they will be attuned to thinking that you could substitute for markets, planning in all of its varieties, including the techno version, but also, government control over, health, human services, and obviously education, right? Health, education, human services. Those are all going to be much more, the state in terms of the city is going to be, it's de Blasio plus. So that's what you're going to get. Yeah.
Right. So Zoran Mamdani himself is not going to bring techno-socialism to New York, but some of the people behind him in the second row or maybe the third row might lean in that direction. And once he runs into trouble, well, he might rely on those people.
Yeah.
Let's talk about artificial intelligence within capitalism. So it's not going to sort out socialism, but for now, it's happening within a capitalist economy. And there has been some quite widespread pessimism, not specifically on the left, but among a certain type of conservatism as well, that this is going to lead to mass unemployment. Now, there is, of course, in one way you could say, well, this people have been saying this about every wave of breakthrough innovation, and it's been predicted many times, and this is just another one of those chapters. In this particular case, though, I've also seen slightly more sophisticated versions of that. So this isn't just a repetition of now we have conveyor belts and therefore everyone will be unemployed, or all the jobs will disappear because everything's going to be made in China. But also the idea that I've seen comparisons with, say, the loss of horsepower in the economy once motor cars became the norm. That the argument was, well, it's not that. Okay, you could imagine a scenario in which machines, robots, AI, whatever, they're better than humans at everything. But normally, then you would have the theory of comparative advantage applying. There might still be some things where humans have a comparative advantage, and that's what we'll do, and we'll leave the rest to these super sophisticated machines. Yeah. But then the argument is, well, once cars and trains and mechanical transport became the norm, horses were not doing different roles, something where they had a comparative advantage in. They just had, well, no role in production anymore at all, and they were just used for leisure. Could there be an equivalent to that? Mass unemployment, because there's not even going to be a comparative advantage left for humans.
So, as you know, this gets to be a complicated question within economics about, the compensation package that economic growth and development gives us. So when we got indoor plumbing, we got rid of the, water carriers. When we got electricity, we got rid of the whaling industry, kind of thing. That's more like the line that you're talking about, as opposed to just Ludditism, in some general form. And so the belief is that we experience such increases in economic growth because of that then the people who lost out, the whalers or the water carriers, get compensated in better living standards, longer lives, healthier lives, these same things like that. Okay. All right. So I don't think we want to debate necessarily that over time or whatever, but I think we want to make an argument instead, is that what I mentioned to you this earlier, but I am an AI optimist because I'm an AGI skeptic. I don't think computers can substitute for humans when it comes to issues like judgment and in general consciousness, that minds are different than machines. All right. And that this is a debate that goes all the way back to, Michael Polanyi debating Alan Turing in 1949 on mind and machine, and these discussions of these things. Just to put this in my own thing here, which is being a teacher, Arthur C. Clarke famously said, every teacher that can be replaced by a computer should be replaced by a computer. I think that people get confused about that sentence because it says every teacher that can be replaced by a computer. For any of us who, like us, you and I, we were professional students. We went to school forever. During that time of school, from elementary school to our PhD, we certainly had teachers that could be replaced. And some of those teachers were terrible, right? But there's also other teachers that there's no way in hell they ever could be replaced because they were the transformative teachers in our lives. They turned us on to certain ideas. They expressed themselves in ways that we had aspirations to try to be like or whatever. And so I think that what's going to happen is, every teacher that can be will be, but not all teachers can be. And those are going to be the ones that have the higher rates of return. Now, what happens to the ones that can be replaced? Well, that's more like the water carriers, and they're going to be displaced and they have to go elsewhere. And so I recommend to all of the listeners to look up a podcast between Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, and Ray Kurzweil, the techno guy that's in charge, that came up with the singularity moment, right? And Sachs is repeating kind of what you just said. One, the wonders of the AI, but oh my God, look at what's going to happen. We're going to lose all these jobs. We're going to do all these things like that. It's going to be terrible. And Kurzweil responds back to him and says, listen, we've been thinking about this wrong ever since Alan Turing, right? We think of this as a substitute, but instead we have to think of it as an augmenting tool. Now, why does that matter? All right, let me tackle one other big issue and see how it might matter. I don't know if it's going to matter. This is just a hope on mine. But one of the real challenges that economies face in Europe and in the United States is aging population. So we have a depopulation problem and we have an aging population. So the younger generation is not having as many kids to replace, and the older generation is living longer. Okay. So we have a kind of an upside down Christmas tree in society, which is less people and more people up here. Now, what's the problem? As you get older, your labor productivity declines. And as you get older, new ideas decline, right? So you don't get the rate of innovation. Innovation comes from younger people. Labor productivity gains come from younger people. If you're getting an aging population, not only are you losing out on just the demographics, you're losing out on the economic productivity, the thing that moves the total factor productivity curve out, right? But now imagine if what AI allows us to do is expand our productivity as workers and also expand our productivity as we age. So now we augment it with AI, we maybe can be an innovator at 65, at 70 or whatever, whereas before you were only an innovator at 45 or whatever. And so it may be the case that the AI as an augment to human beings will extend our intelligence, make us smarter than how we are, and allow us to actually come up with the solutions. And this is like a Julian Simon type thing. The greatest resource is the human imagination. Imagine if we can augment the human imagination, how much, we can actually have greater bursts. And so, if you think about it, modern economic growth is not limited to just being able to increase the marginal productivity of workers. It's about taking that supply curve and shifting it way the hell out, right? That's how we get this amazing expansion. And maybe AI is the way that we, enter into a true period of abundance, as the current, popular phrase is, but it's driven by markets. It's abundance driven, not by government. It's driven by markets utilizing all the tools available to them to come up with better and cheaper ways for us to solve our problems. And, that's, my hope. So I'm an optimist in that front, totally optimistic. But the reason why I'm optimistic is because I don't see it as wiping us out. And so I think right now there's a bit of a bubble over extravagant claims about what AI can achieve. And so we're going to have to adjust and adapt to that bubble being corrected. But then we'll be on the right path of using technology in the way that I think will augment our lives and make us, live longer and healthier and more prosperous lives. Yeah. As long as we get freedom. But if you try to substitute in, if we turn to planning and regimentation and the state as utilizing this tool for particular purposes that our political elites decide are the highest valued uses, then we're not going to experience this. But it's not because technology is trapped. It's because bad ideas have come to take over and they utilize whatever existing technology they can as a tool of social control.
Well, I'm certainly far more afraid of bad ideas than of any type of technology.
Yes.
But okay, so you're an optimist about AI as long as it happens within the right economic system, as long as it happens within a capitalist economy. But you would agree with the pessimists that it is a big deal. Whereas I've also seen people argue, I think Brian Kaplan is in that camp, who argued that it's all a bit of a hype, is all a bit overblown, if I understand him correctly. And that the argument is that it is a bit like the introduction of the internet in the 1990s, something which I have extremely vague memories of, but I do vaguely remember there were people also saying in the late 90s that this is going to totally transform everything in the world in 25 years' time, will be completely unrecognizable to us. Whereas we can now, looking back, we can now say, well, it isn't really. Of course, it has changed a lot of things.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, this is still vaguely, in some ways, the world that I can remember from my teenage years, the pre-internet or very early internet days. Could not something like this also be true of AI, that we now, that in 20 years' time, we look back on some of the things that are now being written about AI and think, wow, this was all a hype, this was all overblown. Yes, we have some nice tools now that were not doable in the 2020s, tools which can do things that were not previously possible. But has it transformed everything? No. And it's also, one thing about the internet is that we don't really see it. Somebody said we we can see the effect everywhere except in the productivity statistics, that it hasn't even made that much of a difference to productivity growth, where you would surely have expected in the 1990s, well, if once everyone has internet access and, computers become cheaper and more accessible, that's going to have, at least, even if it's not going to transform everything, but it will show up in productivity measures in at least aggregate terms. Could this not be a similar kind of bubble?
Yeah, that's part of my issue about how we're going to have to adapt and adjust to learning that we've been overhyping. But let me give you an example from academia, because everyone's very concerned that students are using these large language models to do their homework and whatnot. And so some professors are going back where they only use blue book exams. They, to try to find all these things like that. I don't react that way. Now, part of it is because I teach graduate students, so it's a different population, but they can cheat just like undergraduates, right? And I never worry about it, because what I tell them is that if I wanted to get fit, I would probably try to learn how to do pull-ups, right? And I would go to the gym and I would work on doing pull-ups. And when I'm learning that, one of the things I might rely on is a resistance band. If anyone goes to a gym, they'll see people learning to do pull-ups by putting a resistance band. They put one of their foots in the resistance band, and that resistance band takes some of their weight off of them, and they learn how to do the pull-ups with the correct form. Eventually, so they start out with a big, thick resistance band, then they get a smaller one. Eventually, they don't have to use the resistance band, and they can just do the pull-ups themselves. They are doing the exercise and they're being augmented by the resistance band. They could build a platform that just went up and down. And so they could have a platform and they could grab onto the bar and the machine could just move them up and down. And the question is that who's cheating who? Right? So you would be cheating yourself, because you're not going to get fit by going up and down on the platform. You're not going to be able to, and so you're not going to exercise your mind if the only way that you interact with the machine is to just simply copy down what the machine spits out. But how about if you have a conversation with the machine and you learn how to ask prompts in a certain way, and all of a sudden now you're learning by having this tremendous tool which scrapes the internet, because that's all it's doing. It's scraping the internet and telling you what's out there. And if you think about it, we've been doing this kind of thing forever. It's just that this is now a more faster and improved way to do it. In the old days, when I started, I'm sure this wasn't true for you, but when I started, you went to the library, and the library didn't even have a computer catalog. It had cards in a card holder, and you would go there and you'd alphabetical and you try to find what the card was, and you pull it up, you go to the bookshelf or whatever. If you wanted to read journals, you went to the library and the journals were stacked on the library, and you would pull them down and read them. You didn't have any databases. Do you know how thrilling it was for me when I started out as finishing my dissertation, and now I moved to being a professor, when they introduced library data sets, and I was able to sit at my computer and say, hey, what kind of book is this? And I look it up and everything like that. Originally, they, of course, were very primitive compared to today. And then what happened was we got other better search engines and better, data sets. When I was midway through my assistant professor years, there's this thing evolved called EconLit. And so you could say, I want to find out what everyone's saying about socialism. I go to EconLit and I'd say socialism, and it would spit out all the articles that have been written on socialism. So I could then find them or whatever. I didn't have to, search serendipitously. I just ended up by getting them right there. And so to me, I think what's going on now is we still humans have to teach people. Teachers have to teach how to prompt the machines to get the best answers, right? It's still the case that we have to have judgment to sort what are ghosts and made up answers and what ones are not right and what and so. But I think it's not correct to say that interacting with this machinery can't help us become better scholars, rather than the idea that the only way to be a good scholar is to go back and get rid of typewriters and have to, use a quill pen to write down, like in nice, I mean, it's all about utilizing the technology that's available to us to expand the knowledge base in society. So, okay. So back up a second, go back from scholarship to society as a whole, the big problem that you're hitting on is that we are in a kind of a period where we move from agricultural society to an industrial society, and an industrial society to a quasi post-industrial society. And what does that look like in terms of the future? Well, does it look similar to like when we move from agriculture to industry? So like less people on the farm, more people in the cities, this kind of stuff. What does it look like now? And I think, we're not going to know that for another 100 years, and we see how this all unfolds. But in my, sense of things, the only way we're really going to know how that pattern evolves in a way that is, most productive to us is what Hayek talks about in the chapter in the Constitution of Liberty called The Creative Powers of a Free Civilization. And he compares and contrasts in a footnote in that chapter of what it's like to do innovation when you have to go by committee versus innovation when the dissenter is allowed to be free, right? So, he's quoting Sir Arthur Lewis, who's one of his students, who's, also at the LSE that went on to win a Nobel Prize, but who did work on entrepreneurship and market makers in less developed economies. And he contrasts this idea. He always says that, look, the innovator is always going to be someone who's, outside the accepted wisdom. And so if we judge them only by the accepted wisdom, we'll never allow the outsider idea to take place. And so, for your listeners, one of my favorite books of recent times was by Matt Ridley called How Innovation Works. And he has a great turn of phrase in there. He says, innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. And I think that's just a wonderful phraseology. And I think if we unpack his difference between invention and innovation, that what you will have with technology that is a tool of social control is you might have innovation, but you might have invention, but you don't have innovation. And it's innovation that generates the prosperity that we all benefit from. So we need to have that creative juices of a free society to be able to make the best use of the technologies and the evolution of technologies around us. I don't think, by the way, Brian would disagree with me on any of that. I think that he and I share a similar kind of, this is a very big hype at the moment, and that the way to sort out between the BS of the hype and the reality of the hype is to allow for like Julian Simon type processes of the human imagination being able to go free. Yeah.
Yeah, I try not to make any predictions because I'm old enough to remember what was written in the early days of the internet, and a lot of it hasn't aged well. I don't want people going back in 10 years, 20 years to have the stuff that I'm writing today, because I'm sure it will turn out to be mostly nonsense. And yes, otherwise, I guess it really is more about technologies aren't in themselves good or bad. It depends on the system and the framework in which it all unfolds. This earlier point that you mentioned about students using AI to cheat, I hear this a lot as well from people I know in academia, that they say, well, all of the essays that we get, they're all ChatGPT written, and you can't really correct any or mark any exams anymore and all that. But there, I guess the problem is, and that will be the difference to your gym analogy. This is a problem. If you assume that people go to university in order to build up human capital in the way that somebody goes to a gym in order to build up muscle mass. If the latter is your goal, of course, say a certificate which just says this person has been to the gym when they quite obviously haven't, that doesn't help you. Whereas in the university equivalent there, a certificate which says this person knows a great deal does help you, even if it's not true. If you assume that university is mostly about signaling, this is again Brian Kaplan's thesis, that he says signaling, that you have the right features and attributes that an employer values. That's more like 80% or so of the value of a degree, and that's why, say, jumping ship, dropping out just before you get the degree is almost worthless, whereas ending your gym session at 80% through, well, that's still 80% of the exercise. Maybe that's the difference. I'm afraid that is all we got time for. Thank you very much,
Okay.
Peter, for joining us.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we will hear more about those issues, techno-socialism, techno-capitalism, ideally, what to do with AI, and don't fall for the hype. But this is what the Institute of Economic Affairs is also there for, so that people can separate between the hype and the real economics.
Can I just say one last thing,
Sure.
which is that in the volume that you guys did on Hayek's, 50th anniversary of the Nobel Prize, I have a piece in there on techno-socialism, and there's an error in it. And it's error of massive magnitudes in the beginning, because I forgot to add some zeros to the number of people who have died under the socialist experiment.
Yes,
So,
yes. We corrected that in the online version.
Okay, thank you.
Really, friends, they will still have that.
Thank you, because I want to make sure people understand that the magnitude of the failure of the 20th century with socialism. But again, I greatly appreciate you having me on, and I love the work that IEA does, and just keep doing a great job.
We will. Thank you, Peter. We'll hear from you again.
Alrighty, thanks.